Captain Jake Morrison had been flying A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft for 8 years, but nothing had prepared him for the radio transmission that crackled through his headset on that scorching August morning in Afghanistan. The voice was strained, desperate, and carried the unmistakable sound of gunfire in the background. Any aircraft, this is SEAL Team 7. We are surrounded and taking heavy fire. Grid coordinates follow. The transmission cut through the static like a knife, sending a chill down Morrison's spine despite the desert heat. Morrison was conducting a routine patrol mission over the Helmand province when the distress call came through. His A-10, nicknamed Warthog by pilots for its rugged appearance and devastating firepower, was loaded with ammunition but wasn't officially assigned to any ground support mission that day. According to military protocol, he should have reported the transmission to command and waited for orders. The SEAL team had been conducting a covert reconnaissance mission in a remote valley when everything went wrong. What was supposed to be a simple observation post had turned into a nightmare. The 31 elite Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in a shallow depression surrounded by rocky outcroppings, with enemy fighters closing in from all directions. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, had been frantically calling for air support for the past 20 minutes. His voice grew more urgent with each transmission as the enemy circle tightened. The Taliban fighters had somehow detected their position and launched a coordinated attack with overwhelming numbers. "We've got at least 200 hostiles moving in on our position," Rodriguez reported over the radio, ducking as bullets whizzed overhead. "We need immediate air support or we're not making it out of here." The SEALs had taken position behind whatever cover they could find in the barren landscape. Rocks, small boulders, and a few scattered trees were all that stood between them and the advancing enemy. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen knew they were in serious trouble. Her men were skilled fighters, but they were vastly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Morrison listened to the chaos unfolding below and made a decision that would change everything. He could hear the desperation in the voices, the sound of automatic weapons fire growing closer, and the unmistakable whistle of incoming mortars. These weren't just soldiers in trouble. They were fellow Americans fighting for their lives. The A-10 pilot checked his fuel gauge and weapon systems. He had enough ammunition to make a difference, but engaging without official authorization would mean disobeying direct orders. Military regulations were clear about unauthorized engagement, and the consequences could be severe, including court-martial and the end of his career. But as Morrison listened to another frantic transmission from the ground, describing casualties and dwindling ammunition, military regulations suddenly seemed less important than human lives. He could hear the fear creeping into the voices below, and he knew that waiting for official authorization might mean these brave soldiers wouldn't survive to see another day. The enemy had positioned themselves strategically around the SEALs, using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. Snipers were positioned on high ground, while assault teams moved through ravines and behind rock formations. It was a well-planned ambush, and the Taliban fighters seemed determined to eliminate the entire SEAL team. Morrison's training kicked in as he began calculating attack vectors and identifying targets. The A-10 was specifically designed for close air support missions, with its powerful 30mm GAU-8 cannon, capable of destroying enemy positions while avoiding friendly fire. But flying close air support without proper coordination with ground forces was extremely dangerous. The pilot knew that every second of hesitation meant more bullets flying toward the trapped SEALs below. He could almost picture the scene. Elite warriors pinned down, using their training and courage to fight against impossible odds. These were the same men who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who had families waiting for them at home. As Morrison banked his aircraft toward the coordinates provided by the SEAL team, he made peace with his decision. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, and sometimes a single pilot had to trust his instincts over military bureaucracy. The lives of 31 American heroes hung in the balance, and he wasn't going to let them down. Morrison's hands gripped the flight controls tighter as he pushed his A-10 into a steep dive toward the target area. The radio chatter from his command base was becoming increasingly agitated as they realized one of their aircraft had deviated from its assigned patrol route without authorization. "Thunder 2-1, this is Control. You are ordered to return to assigned patrol area immediately. Acknowledge." The voice of his commanding officer, Colonel Williams, cut through the static with unmistakable authority. Morrison reached for his radio switch, then hesitated. Once he acknowledged the order, there would be no turning back. He would have to abandon the SEALs below and return to his patrol, leaving them to face overwhelming odds alone. The thought made his stomach churn. On the ground, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The SEAL team had been forced to consolidate into an even smaller defensive position as enemy fighters advanced from multiple directions. Lieutenant Commander Chen counted at least 15 muzzle flashes from the rocky ridgeline to their east, while automatic weapons fire erupted from positions to the north and south. "Rodriguez, how long until that air support arrives?" Chen shouted over the gunfire, pressing herself against a boulder as bullets sparked off the rock inches from her head. "Still trying to establish contact, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, working frantically with his radio equipment. "I'm getting some interference, but I think there's an A-10 somewhere in the area." The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully. They had allowed the SEAL team to enter the valley and establish their observation post before revealing their presence. Now they were systematically closing the trap, using superior numbers and prepared positions to overwhelm the American forces. Morrison could see the muzzle flashes below through his targeting system. The thermal imaging clearly showed the heat signatures of the surrounded SEAL team, clustered in a defensive formation, while dozens of enemy fighters moved through the surrounding terrain. The tactical situation was grim. Without immediate intervention, the SEALs would be overrun within minutes. "Thunder 2-1, respond immediately or you will be reported as a rogue aircraft." Colonel Williams's voice crackled over the radio, anger evident in his tone. Morrison finally keyed his microphone. "Control, this is Thunder 2-1. I have American forces in contact. Requesting immediate clearance for close air support." "Negative. Thunder 2-1. No authorized missions in that grid square. Return to base immediately." The pilot felt his jaw clench. Military bureaucracy was about to cost American lives. He knew that by the time proper authorization came through military channels, it would be too late. The SEALs needed help now, not in an hour when the paperwork was processed. Down below, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson had been hit in the shoulder by enemy fire, but continued returning shots with his rifle. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Jennifer Martinez, was treating 2 other wounded SEALs while bullets whistled overhead. The defensive perimeter was shrinking as ammunition ran low. "We've got movement on the west side," called out Chief Petty Officer David Park, the team's sniper. "At least 20 fighters moving through the ravine. They'll be in grenade range in 2 minutes. Chen knew they were running out of options. They could call for extraction, but no helicopter could land in their current position under such heavy fire. They could attempt to break out, but that would mean leaving their wounded behind. The only viable option was air support, but none seemed to be coming. Morrison made his final decision as he watched tracer rounds streaking toward the SEAL position. He switched off his radio and began his attack run, knowing that he was effectively ending his military career. Some things were more important than following orders, and saving American lives was at the top of that list. The A-10's targeting computer locked onto the first group of enemy fighters positioned on the eastern ridge. Morrison could see their muzzle flashes clearly now, and he began calculating the safest approach to eliminate them without endangering the friendly forces below. As Morrison committed to his attack, he thought about his wife Sarah back home in Colorado, and their 2 young children who were probably getting ready for school right now. They would understand why he had to do this, even if it meant facing a court-martial. Some decisions transcended personal consequences. The enemy fighters below had no idea that death was diving toward them from 15,000 feet above. They continued their assault on the trapped SEALs, confident that their superior numbers and prepared positions would ensure victory. They had underestimated both the determination of the American Special Forces below and the courage of one A-10 pilot who refused to abandon his fellow warriors. Morrison's targeting system locked onto the largest concentration of enemy fighters as he began his first strafing run, knowing there was no turning back now. The distinctive sound of the A-10's twin engines grew louder as Morrison descended toward his target. The enemy fighters on the eastern ridge were so focused on their assault that they failed to notice the approaching aircraft until it was almost too late. Morrison's finger hovered over the trigger as he lined up his shot. The Gyu-8 cannon, often called the Tank Buster, was capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of 30mm depleted uranium shells. Each round could penetrate armored vehicles, and against infantry positions the weapon was devastatingly effective. The distinctive sound of the A-10's cannon erupted across the valley as Morrison opened fire. The sound was unlike anything else in modern warfare. A deep, thunderous roar that struck fear into enemy hearts while bringing hope to friendly forces below. The first burst of cannon fire raked across the eastern ridge, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Enemy fighters who had been confidently advancing moments before suddenly found themselves diving for cover as 30mm shells exploded around their positions. Several of the Taliban fighters were eliminated instantly, while others scrambled for better cover among the rocks. On the ground, the SEALs felt a surge of hope as they heard the unmistakable sound of close air support. Lieutenant Commander Chen raised her head cautiously and saw the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 pulling up from its attack run, smoke trailing from its cannon. "That's an A-10, Rodriguez shouted with relief. "We've got a warthog up there." The immediate pressure on the SEAL team's eastern flank was relieved, but enemy fighters continued their assault from the north and south positions. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from multiple locations as he climbed to set up his second attack run. The Taliban commander leading the ambush realized that air support had arrived and began shouting orders to his men. They had planned for the possibility of airstrikes and had prepared several concealed positions among the rocky terrain. Some fighters began moving to predetermined fallback positions, while others attempted to continue the assault before the aircraft could make another pass. Morrison banked his A-10 into a tight turn, scanning the battlefield below through his targeting system. He could see the heat signatures of the SEAL team clearly marked in his thermal display, and he carefully identified enemy positions to avoid any possibility of friendly fire incidents. "Control, any aircraft in the area, this is SEAL Team 7, Rodriguez transmitted on the emergency frequency. "We have an A-10 providing close air support. Unknown call sign. If you can hear this, we need you to hit the North Ridge next. We're taking heavy fire from that position." Morrison heard the transmission and immediately adjusted his approach angle. The North Ridge was more challenging because it was closer to the SEAL position, requiring precision to avoid endangering the friendly forces below. But the A-10 was designed exactly for this type of mission. Chief Park had identified at least 12 enemy fighters positioned among the rocks on the North Ridge, including what appeared to be a machine gun crew that had been particularly effective in pinning down the SEAL team. The enemy position needed to be eliminated quickly before they could cause more casualties. As Morrison lined up his second attack run, he could see tracer rounds still streaming from the North Ridge toward the SEAL position. The enemy fighters seemed determined to continue their assault despite the arrival of air support, either through bravery or desperation. The A-10 dove again, this time approaching from a different angle to catch the enemy fighters from their exposed flank. Morrison's training kicked in as he calculated wind speed, target distance, and the safe zone around the friendly forces below. Brrr. The cannon fired again, this time walking a line of destruction along the North Ridge. The high explosive rounds detonated among the rock formations, sending fragments flying in all directions. The machine gun position was hit directly, eliminating the crew and destroying their weapon. Several enemy fighters who had been advancing toward the SEAL position suddenly found themselves under devastating fire from above. Those who weren't hit immediately began retreating toward better cover, their assault momentum completely broken. Hospital Corpsman Martinez looked up from treating a wounded teammate and saw debris raining down from the North Ridge. "Whoever's flying that bird knows what they're doing," she said to Chen. That was surgical precision. Psychological effect of the A-10's attacks was almost as important as the physical damage. The distinctive sound of the GAU-8 cannon was known throughout Afghanistan as the voice of American air power. Enemy fighters who had moments before been confident in their numerical advantage now found themselves questioning whether to continue the assault or withdraw. Morrison pulled up from his second attack run and immediately began scanning for his next target. The enemy force was larger than he had initially estimated, with fighters positioned in multiple locations around the valley. This was going to require methodical work to systematically eliminate each position while ensuring the safety of the trapped SEALs below. The battle was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. The Taliban forces had regrouped faster than Morrison expected. As he circled overhead, preparing for his third attack run, he noticed movement from multiple positions that hadn't been active before. The enemy commander was clearly experienced and had prepared backup positions for exactly this scenario. Radio chatter erupted from Morrison's command frequency, as his unauthorized actions created chaos in the military command structure. Thunder 2-1, you are ordered to cease all offensive operations immediately and return to base. This is a direct order from General Patterson. Morrison ignored the radio and focused on the battle below. 3 more SEAL team members had been wounded, and their ammunition was running critically low. Every second he delayed meant more American lives at risk. The enemy had begun using a new tactic. Small groups of fighters were moving through concealed ravines, attempting to get close enough to the SEAL position to use grenades and rocket-propelled grenades. Morrison could see their heat signatures moving through the terrain like deadly shadows. Lieutenant Commander Chen had reorganized her team into a tighter defensive circle, with the wounded in the center and the most experienced fighters forming the outer perimeter. Ammunition was being carefully conserved, with each SEAL taking aimed shots rather than suppressive fire. Morrison, if you can hear me, we've got movement in the wadi to our southwest. Chen transmitted on the emergency frequency, using Morrison's name that she had heard from the command radio chatter. Multiple fighters approximately 50 meters from our position and closing. Morrison spotted the group immediately. 8 fighters moving through a dry stream bed, using the natural terrain to approach undetected. They were almost within grenade range of the SEAL team, and he had perhaps 30 seconds before they could launch a devastating close-range assault. The challenge was that the enemy fighters were moving through a narrow ravine directly adjacent to the SEAL position. A single mistake with the cannon fire could result in friendly casualties. Morrison would need to use surgical precision that pushed both his skills and his aircraft to their limits. He rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, approaching the ravine from an angle that would allow him to fire parallel to the SEAL position rather than across it. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than yards. As Morrison lined up his shot, one of the enemy fighters in the ravine raised an RPG launcher, aiming directly at the clustered SEAL team. There was no time for a second chance. This had to be perfect. The cannon erupted again, this time in a short, controlled burst. The 30mm rounds impacted the ravine with devastating accuracy, eliminating the RPG team and scattering the remaining fighters. Dust and smoke rose from the stream bed as the immediate threat was neutralized. But the enemy response was swift and deadly. A shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile streaked up from a concealed position on the southern ridge, forcing Morrison to deploy flares and execute violent, evasive maneuvers. The A-10's robust design and redundant systems were put to the test as he fought to maintain control. Missile launch, Morrison called out instinctively, though no one on his frequency was authorized to provide support. He was completely on his own, facing an enemy that was now specifically targeting his aircraft. Chief Park had seen the missile launch and immediately began scanning for the launch position through his sniper scope. "I've got the missile team on the south ridge," he called out to Chen. "They're setting up for another shot." The SEAL sniper took careful aim despite the ongoing firefight around him. His $300 Winchester Magnum rifle cracked once and the enemy missile operator dropped. Park immediately shifted targets to the missile reloader, firing again with deadly precision. Morrison completed his evasive maneuvers and climbed back to a safer altitude, assessing his aircraft for damage. The A-10 had been designed to absorb punishment and continue flying, and despite the close call with the missile, all systems remained operational. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly. Morrison estimated that he had eliminated approximately 40 enemy fighters, but at least 60 more remained in various positions around the valley. The SEALs were holding their ground, but they were still vastly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. What worried Morrison most was his own fuel situation. The A-10 was a relatively fuel-efficient aircraft, but the constant maneuvering and multiple attack runs were consuming fuel faster than planned. He estimated perhaps 20 more minutes of combat time before he would be forced to leave for refueling. The enemy commander seemed to recognize the same timing issue. Radio intercepts suggested that the Taliban fighters were being ordered to maintain their positions and wait for the aircraft to leave. Once Morrison was forced to depart, they could resume their assault with overwhelming numbers. Rodriguez worked frantically with his radio, trying to contact any other aircraft in the area. Any aircraft, this is SEAL Team 7. We have an A-10 providing close air support, but we need additional assets. We are surrounded and taking casualties." The response came from an unexpected source. "SEAL Team 7, this is Apache 2-6. We've been monitoring your traffic and are inbound your position. ETA 12 minutes. Chen felt a surge of hope. Apache attack helicopters were exactly what they needed to break the enemy's resolve and provide a path for extraction. But 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours if they couldn't survive that long. Morrison heard the Apache transmission and felt relief wash over him. Help was coming, but until then he was the only thing standing between the SEAL team and annihilation. He began planning his next series of attacks, knowing that each one might be his last. Morrison's fuel gauge was approaching critical levels as he prepared for what might be his final attack run. The Apache helicopters were still 8 minutes away, and the enemy forces were preparing for a coordinated assault from all directions. Time was running out for everyone involved. The Taliban commander had grown frustrated with the effectiveness of the A-10's interventions and decided to risk everything on one massive assault. Radio intercepts indicated that all remaining fighters were being ordered to advance simultaneously, accepting heavy casualties to overwhelm the American position through sheer numbers. On the ground, the SEAL team could see enemy fighters emerging from concealment all around their position. What had started as an ambush by a large but manageable force had evolved into a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds. "Here they come," Chief Park announced grimly as he counted muzzle flashes appearing from dozens of positions. "I count at least 50 fighters moving on our position from all directions." Lieutenant Commander Chen checked her ammunition, 2 magazines left. Around the defensive perimeter, her team members were in similar situations. They had fought brilliantly and held their ground against impossible odds, but mathematics was catching up with them. Hospital Corpsman Martinez had done everything possible for the wounded, but several team members were in serious condition and needed immediate medical evacuation. The nearest hospital was over an hour away by helicopter, assuming they could even establish a landing zone. Morrison could see the tactical picture developing below and realized that conventional strafing runs would no longer be effective. The enemy fighters were too close to the SEAL position, and the risk of friendly fire incidents was too high. He needed a different approach. The A-10 pilot made a decision that went against every safety protocol in military aviation. He would use his aircraft as a psychological weapon, flying extremely low passes to break up the enemy assault even if he couldn't safely engage with his cannon. Morrison pushed his A-10 into a steep dive, aiming directly at the largest concentration of advancing enemy fighters. He planned to pull up at the last possible moment, using the aircraft's intimidating presence and the roar of its engines to scatter the attackers. The enemy fighters on the northern approach saw the A-10 diving directly toward them and assumed they were about to be strafed. Many dove for cover or broke off their advance, disrupting the coordinated timing of the assault. Morrison pulled up with barely 50 feet to spare, his aircraft shaking from the violent maneuver. "Did you see that?" Rodriguez shouted with amazement. "He's using his plane like a battering ram." The tactic worked, but only temporarily. The enemy fighters quickly realized they hadn't been fired upon and resumed their advance. Morrison needed to buy more time, but his fuel situation was becoming critical. Chief Park had been tracking an enemy sniper who had been particularly effective throughout the battle. The Taliban marksman was positioned in an almost perfect location with excellent fields of fire across the SEAL position. Park had been waiting for the right opportunity to take the shot. As Morrison's low pass temporarily disrupted the assault, Park saw his chance. The enemy sniper briefly exposed himself to track the aircraft, giving Park the target he needed. The SEAL sniper's rifle cracked once more, and a significant threat was eliminated. But the respite was brief. Enemy fighters were now within 50 meters of the SEAL position on multiple sides, and grenades were beginning to land near the defensive perimeter. The situation had become desperate. Morrison made another low pass, this time from a different direction, scattering another group of advancing fighters. But he could see on his fuel gauge that he had perhaps 2 more passes before he would be forced to leave or risk running out of fuel entirely. "SEAL Team 7, this is Apache 2-6. We are 4 minutes out. Can you mark your position?" Chen grabbed a signal flare from her equipment. "Marking position with red smoke," she transmitted, igniting the flare and tossing it a few meters from their defensive position. Morrison could see the red smoke rising from the SEAL position and immediately began planning how to coordinate with the incoming Apache helicopters. The attack helicopters would be far more effective at close-range combat, but they needed to survive the next 4 minutes. The enemy commander seemed to realize that additional air support was incoming and ordered his fighters to make a final, all-out assault. Enemy forces began advancing from every direction simultaneously, accepting heavy casualties in an attempt to overrun the American position before the helicopters arrived. Morrison knew this was the critical moment. He had enough fuel for one more attack run, and it had to count. He selected his largest cluster of enemy fighters and began his final dive, knowing that after this pass he would have to leave the SEALs to face whatever came next. As the A-10 screamed toward the ground once more, Morrison reflected on the decision that had brought him to this moment. He had disobeyed direct orders, risked his career, and put his aircraft in extreme danger. But looking at the courage of the men below who refused to surrender despite impossible odds, he knew he had made the right choice. The cannon roared one final time as Morrison expended the last of his ammunition on the largest group of enemy fighters. As he pulled up from his attack run, he could see Apache helicopters appearing on the horizon, racing toward the battle at maximum speed. Help was finally arriving, but the next few minutes would determine whether the SEAL team would survive to see it. The thunder of Apache helicopter rotors filled the valley as two AH-64 attack helicopters arrived on station. Morrison, now critically low on fuel, coordinated the handoff of the battle to the fresh aircraft before reluctantly turning toward base. Apache 2-6, this is Thunder 2-1. I am Winchester on ammunition and bingo fuel. SEAL team is marked with red smoke. Enemy forces are approximately 30 meters from friendly position on all sides. Danger close situation. Copy Thunder 2-1, we have the SEALs marked. Outstanding work down there. We'll take it from here. As Morrison climbed away from the battlefield, he watched the Apache helicopters engage the remaining enemy forces with devastating precision. Their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles quickly broke the back of the Taliban assault, sending surviving fighters fleeing into the mountains. The immediate threat to the SEAL team was over, but Morrison knew his own battle was just beginning. His radio crackled with messages ordering him to land immediately and report to the command post. His unauthorized engagement had saved American lives, but it had also violated direct orders from senior officers. 3 hours later, Morrison sat in a Stark conference room at Bagram Airfield, facing a panel of senior officers, including General Patterson himself. His flight suit had been replaced with dress uniform, and the weight of potential court-martial proceedings hung heavy in the air. Captain Morrison, General Patterson began, his voice stern and unforgiving. You deliberately disobeyed direct orders from multiple superior officers. You engaged enemy forces without authorization. You put a valuable aircraft at risk in an unauthorized mission. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Morrison stood at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Sir, I heard American forces in distress and took action to preserve life. I accept full responsibility for my actions. The general studied Morrison for a long moment before opening a folder on his desk. The SEAL team you assisted has submitted their after-action report. All 31 members survived the engagement. Lieutenant Commander Chen estimates that without your intervention, casualties would have been catastrophic. Morrison remained at attention, unsure whether this information would help or hurt his case. Military justice was often complicated, and doing the right thing didn't always align with following orders. General Patterson continued reading. Chief Park counted 73 confirmed enemy casualties from your engagement alone. The Apache crews credited your initial attacks with breaking the enemy's coordination and making their job significantly easier. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Morrison's future hung in the balance as the officers conferred quietly among themselves. He thought about his wife and children back home, wondering if his decision to save the SEAL team would cost his family their livelihood. Colonel Williams, Morrison's commanding officer who had initially ordered him to return to base, spoke next. Captain Morrison, your actions violated military regulations and chain of command. However, they also exemplified the highest traditions of military service and putting the welfare of fellow service members above personal considerations. General Patterson closed the folder and looked directly at Morrison. The decision has been made to take no disciplinary action regarding your unauthorized engagement. Your actions saved American lives, and that will always be the most important consideration in this command. Morrison felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, but he maintained his military bearing. Thank you, sir. However, The general continued. We cannot have pilots making independent decisions about when to engage. Military discipline requires following orders, even when individual judgment might suggest otherwise. You will undergo additional training on rules of engagement and command authority. 2 weeks later, Morrison found himself at Walter Reed Medical Center, visiting some of the wounded SEALs who had been evacuated from the valley. Hospital Corpsman Martinez had lost partial hearing from the explosions, but was expected to make a full recovery. Captain Morrison, she said as he entered her room, I wanted to thank you personally. You saved our lives out there. Chief Park, who was recovering from shrapnel wounds, shook Morrison's hand firmly. Sir, I've been in the Navy for 15 years and I've never seen flying like that. You put your aircraft right where it needed to be every single time. Lieutenant Commander Chen was the last SEAL Morrison visited. She had been promoted and was preparing to return to duty despite her own injuries. Captain, I've written a letter to your commanding officer recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did out there went beyond the call of duty. Morrison was surprised by the recommendation. Ma'am, I was just doing my job. No, Captain. Your job was to fly a patrol route. What you did was choose to save lives over following orders. That took courage, and it deserves recognition. 6 months later, Captain Jake Morrison stood before his squadron as Colonel Williams pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to his uniform. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial flight." Captain Morrison's outstanding airmanship and selfless devotion to duty resulted in the successful rescue of 31 American service members. In the audience, Morrison's wife Sarah watched with pride, holding their 2 children who had finally learned why their father had been so worried for several weeks. The SEAL team members who could attend the ceremony stood at attention, their presence a testament to Morrison's decision that August morning. As the ceremony concluded, Morrison reflected on the lesson he had learned. Sometimes courage meant following orders, and sometimes it meant breaking them. The difference lay in understanding when human lives mattered more than military protocol. In a profession where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death, judgment and character were often more important than regulations. The story of Morrison's unauthorized rescue became legend in military aviation circles, a reminder that the best warriors are those who know when to follow rules and when to follow their conscience. The 31 Navy SEALs who survived that day would never forget the A-10 pilot who chose to disobey orders rather than abandon his fellow Americans in their darkest hour.